All right. As we looked at Ephesians chapter 4, it's against the message that's being given here is one of unity. Paul is both been praying for and talking about the unity that involves the church. And what Paul's going to do here as we get through verses 11 to 13 today, he's going to talk about specifically how he does that. But in the first section, he's really been talking about why he does that. And this is all a follow-on to chapters 1, 2, and 3, which is the theology of who is it that does it. And of course, it's God himself. So Ephesians chapter 4, now we're going to start at verse 1. We're going to go down to 13 today. Now, I say that even though the context goes clear down to 16, there's so much to cover today. So Ephesians 4, verse 1. Therefore, I, the prisoner of the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you've been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, being diligent to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And again, as I mentioned before, this is the key verse to understanding this chapter, verse 3. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you are also called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. But to each one of us grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led captive the captives, and he gave gifts to people. Now this expression, he ascended, what does it mean except that he also had descended into the lower parts of the earth? He who descended is himself also he who ascended far above the heavens so that he might fill all things. And he gave some as apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, some as pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. I think that's where we'll stop today. So as we begin this chapter, again, last week we started to touch on this idea that there's a unity that's in the first part of the chapter. Remember how many ones there were in chapter 4? And I'm looking at verses 4, 5, and 6. Remember how many there were there? It's a number of perfection. Just keep that in mind. Huh? 7, yeah. Yeah, one body, one Spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father overall, who's over all, through all, and in all. And the idea of unity is there, and that God's trying to do one thing. He's trying to build up his church so that they're unified in the Spirit, and they're unified on their purpose. But what's interesting is we get to verse 11, and he's using a diverse set of gifts in order to do that. And when you think about the body of Christ, it is exactly that, isn't it? It's one God who's trying to make sure that his church is unified, but he does that with a diverse set of group gifts and a diverse set of people. Nobody in this room is the same kind of person. We all have different perspectives, different backgrounds, different bringings up, different histories. And God has brought you all here today. I can say that because God's sovereign, not because it's part of God's great big master plan that everybody has to end up at grace, but you all are here, and I appreciate that you're being here today. So as we begin, we're going to think about that idea of unity through diversity as he begins it today. So verse 11, he says, and he gave some as apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, some as pastors and teachers. I mentioned this last week, but verses 11 to 16 is really one long sentence. So it's a little bit hard for me, just viscerally, just in my gut, to break up a passage and a group that goes together, or a paragraph. And yet there's enough to cover here that will consume me. The goal of this sentence, though, is to give shape to how the church is empowered to build itself up in unity, and how God himself intends to build up the church in unity. It is both a God-given gift to the church that these people come along, but it's also then the church's responsibility to take those gifts and the teaching and the responsibility and do something with it because of the gifts they've been given. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, notice that Christ is the giver. He is the giver because he is the conqueror. And this, of course, we have based on our understanding back in verse 7, which says, "But to each one of us grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift." And again, I mentioned before, last time we talked, let me get to my PowerPoint here. That there are many gifts. And remember how many lists of gifts there are? Okay, I'll give you two choices. Do you want to answer how many lists there are, or do you want to list which chapters they are? I can give you listing the chapters they are is actually the easier one, because it's either a 4 or a 12. So it's Ephesians 4 and 1 Peter 4, 1 Corinthians 12, or Romans 12. Did you know that?
No.
A pioneer learning today. A pioneer experience. So let's look at this together. And of course, I have multiple things. I'm in the way of my own. So Romans 12. However, since we have gifts that differ according to the grace given to each of us to use them properly, if prophecy in proportion to one's faith, and service in the act of serving, or the one who teaches in the act of teaching, or the one who exhorts in the work of exhortation, the one who gives with generosity, the one who's in leadership with diligence, the one who shows mercy with cheerfulness. So this is again part of the, what's the title? The 12s. So we have Romans 12, and then we have 1 Corinthians 12. And to one who's been given, to one who's given the word of wisdom through the Spirit, and to another the word of knowledge according to the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, and to another gifts of healing by one Spirit, and to another the effecting of miracles, and to others prophecy, and to another distinguishing of spirits, and to another various kinds of tongues, and to another interpretation of tongues. So you have, again, two different lists so far in 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans chapter 12. But that's not all. But wait. And I'm having issues today. See? All right, so 1 Corinthians, this is the second part. So that's where I say there are 5 lists. I didn't tell you that before. There are 5 lists in 4 chapters. There's no 3, 2, 1. That's all there is to it. Just 5 and 4. And then 12 and 4. And God has appointed the church, first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healing, helps, administrations, various kinds of tongues, and you get the idea. There are just many gifts. And what's interesting is that it's not like one list and it's enumerated 5 separate times. It's a slightly different grouping depending on who the audience is and what his purpose is. Now, that'll come into play, I think, a little bit later. You may have some questions based on that. But if you take I need to keep going. Ephesians 4, and he gave some as apostles, some as prophets, some as teachers, or some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ. Now we'll go through that verse specifically. And then, of course, 1 Peter 4, verses 10 and 11. Each one has received a special gift. Employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the multifaceted grace of God. Keep that thought in mind, that when you've been given a gift, you're meant to use the gift, not admire the gift, right? And this will come into play even in what Paul has to say to the Ephesians. Whoever speaks is to do so as one who's speaking the actual words of God. Whoever serves is to do so as one who's serving by the strength which God supplies, so that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belongs the glory and dominion forever and ever. All right, the idea of even who speaks almost brings into mind the second commandment of the 10 commandments. Can anybody anybody recite the second commandment? Anybody remember remember there are 10 commandments, right?
Thou shalt not have any graven images.
Okay, then maybe it's the third. Huh? Take the Lord's name in vain. If you start to attribute that the Lord said this and the Lord didn't, you're taking the Lord's name, his character, his teaching in vain. And so so much more, part of the reason that James and now Peter both say it's a difficult thing to be a teacher, because when you start to attribute God says this or God means that, it's a dangerous thing for you to stand up here, right? It's like when you ever have somebody who says, gee, I'd like to learn patience. The first thing I want to do is step about 10 feet back in case the lightning strikes here. Because when someone says, I want to learn patience, the first thing they're going to happen is they're going to learn patience through trial and tribulation. And it'll go well because that's what God intends, but God will answer your prayer. You will have trials and tribulations to learn patience. In the same way, imagine being a teacher then, and someone says, I'd like to be a teacher. I'd like to step about 5 yards back sometimes and just watch what happens. We have to be careful because we're called to speak for God. But we do so as one who's empowered by God to do that. All right, so all told, there are 5 lists, and between those 4 chapters and 5 lists, there are more than 20 gifts that are mentioned. And again, no one list has them all, nor do all the lists agree. It's just God empowering the church in a location at a different time and a different place for specific purposes. And so I think as the need arises, God raises a gift. And as the need decreases, God removes the gift, if that can sound. And that can happen in a number of ways that I don't really have time to go over today. But everybody clear then on the 4 passages? Let's see. Let's stop that right there. On the 4 passages then, and the 5 lists, and again, they're God's gifts to the church. They're God's gifts to the church. The people are the gifts to the church, right? The first of the gifts, the first of these gifts to the church are elsewhere referred to as being foundational. The church was built on these as a foundation. They carried the message of God as demonstrated by miracles. They planted churches and gave direction to the local churches, and they're called apostles. Again, this letter was written from prison within a few short years at the end of Paul's life. And what Paul seems to indicate in this letter is the need for establishing the foundation of churches and that it still exists. That it's not soon going away. Now, I think historically, we understand that the need for apostles went away towards the end of the 1st century. Historically, I think you see that. But the gift of apostleship is a foundational gift. Someone said, Gina's favorite ancient Near East teacher, Chrysostom,
You never shared that.
He's digging in.
Chrysostom says this. He says, it's an interesting comment on the apostles, but his commentary on the book of Ephesians, he says apostles, for these had all the gifts. So remember who Chrysostom is, first of all? The blank looks. If I were Scottish, I'd say your glaikit looks. But these blank looks across your face going, he was one of the, he really wasn't an apostle, but he was a disciple of the Apostle John. Yeah. So he was very near towards the end of the 1st century into the 2nd century. And he knew whereof he'd been taught. 1, he'd observed it, and 2, he'd been taught it by John. So when he says that the apostles had all the gifts, I kind of sit up and take notice. And I don't think I've ever saw that. I don't think I ever saw that before. So again, the gift of apostleship is a foundational gift, and one who seems to have both teaching and evangelism and being a prophet. So being able to do all these things. In fact, teaching almost inhabits all these foundational gifts, but the apostles seem to have had all of them. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, I'm just going to leave that up there. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 28, we read, and God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healing, helps, administrations, and various kinds of tongues. Remember, too, that although the church started off with the 12, and they were apostles, and when Judas died, he was replaced, there were still others that were added besides that. So Matthias replaced Judas, but then you have Paul and Barnabas who came along in Acts chapter 13, and they're mentioned as specifically apostles. In 2 Corinthians 8, verse 23, Titus and others are named messengers. But if you're familiar enough with your Greek language, messengers is just another English word for what we'd also translate as being apostles. They were people who had multiple gifts, and they were foundational. And that's part of why you see Timothy and Titus going off to help establish churches in other places, because they were gifted as messengers or apostles. 30 years after the founding of the church at Pentecost, there was apparently still a thriving, still functioning group of apostles who were establishing churches and so were gifts to the local church to help them get started. Paul doesn't say, and there were apostles, but he says they are apostles, right? And there were as in past tense, but these individuals were given to the church. The apostle, as we've seen in Paul, is a primary foundational role to preach the gospel. All right, that brings us to prophets. There are New Testament prophets who were prompted by the Spirit to speak a particularly relevant message to individuals or to the church. So you might be familiar with Agabus, right, in Acts chapter 11, or Judas and Silas in Acts chapter 15, or Philip the evangelist and his 4 daughters. Philip the evangelist was this kind of an interesting combination. Philip the evangelist had 4 daughters, all of whom were prophets. And Agabus again in Acts chapter 21. God had particular messages to individuals in 1 Corinthians 14, verses 24 to 25. And it's this gift that Paul regulates how they should share what the Spirit impresses on their heart in 1 Corinthians 14. We'll touch on that again in a little bit. But just to kind of briefly, remember we have 1 Corinthians 12. And what's that? What did we see today was included in 1 Corinthians 12? Gifts, thank you. And what do we see in 1 Corinthians 14? How to exercise those gifts. And what happens between 1 Corinthians 12 and 1 Corinthians 14? I know this is a math problem, but I know you can do it. 13, right? Which is the love chapter, right? And the love chapter is about the how and the why we exercise those gifts. I should say it's the why we exercise those gifts, the way we do. And then 1 Corinthians 14 is the how we exercise those gifts. We exercise them for unity. We exercise them not for our personal pleasure, but we exercise them to build up one another in this most holy faith. So 12, 13, and 14 all go together. Don't interrupt them, except unless you're preaching very long messages. Then you can leave it together. But if you've got short messages, you kind of have to trunch them up a little bit. But it's interesting that, again, the prophets are among them. And Paul would say, for instance, when there's someone standing up and he's being a prophet, and someone else stands up to prophesy, what's the first prophet supposed to do? I'm going to say it a little bit firmer. He's to be silent. In the same way that the women are supposed to be silent later on. Now, why does that become important? Sometimes we come to the aspect of, I'm speaking out of school at this point, literally and figuratively. Sometimes when the women are supposed to be silent, some people get the idea they're supposed to be silent at all times, forever and ever. And nobody should say amen to that. No, it's in this instance, the women are supposed to be silent. In the same way that the prophet, if the prophet stood up his very first day, imagine, I went to prophet school, I'm ready to stand up and usher my prophecy, and I'm busy speaking, and a minute I'm talking, somebody else stands up and speaks, and I'm thinking, I've lost my job, I've got to have to sit down and be quiet forever. Because the word is used, it's the same word in both places in the same chapter. It's never a be silent forever. It's a be silent in this context when someone else is exercising their gift. God's not an author of confusion. Sit down and be quiet. Pay attention to what they're saying, and then you can have your turn later. So it's just a matter of bringing order to the church. All right, we can talk about 1 Corinthians 14 again some other day. Maybe we'll go through 1 Corinthians in 2025 or 2026. All right, so apostles, prophets, and now evangelists. Evangelists are those people who are able to leverage the gospel preached by themselves or others, such as apostles, and they're able to bring in a harvest. Now, they're not able to bring in a harvest by their reasoning, by their power of induction, by their persuasive abilities. They're doing it by the Spirit of God, right? As with all the gifts. And the interesting part about this gift, as with all these foundational gifts, is that the person is a gift to the church, but the ministry of the individual is not to the church, but to those who are not part of the church. I'm going to say that again. The interesting part about this gift is that the person is a gift to the church, but the ministry of the individual is not to the church, but to those who are not part of the church, so that we can gather them in and make them part of the church. We can gather them in because they're now part of the church. To the unbelievers, but they work at adding members to the church. All right, any questions? I know this is stuff we've been over all before. Any questions? I should even ask criticisms or complaints. All right. All right, so now we get to pastor teachers. So we're at Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11. And he gave some apostles, some prophets, some as evangelists, and some as pastor teachers. Now I can't remember what slide I have next. Yeah, I'm gonna leave that there. Last week I handed this out. I handed out a black and white version. I'm gonna leave them up here. These are the spares I had. If you didn't get them, they're there. And this just lists all the verses that on this page, the next page. We're not going to go through all these verses today. That's not why we're going to run out of time. We're running out of time because I don't manage my time well. That's just a whole different problem. All right. So, but this is the slide I want you to pay attention to. We see this title, pastor, and what does the Bible mean when it says that? We think we know because we've all been likely raised in churches. So we have an idea of the pastor and what the pastor does. Pastor is usually the public face to many churches who stands up in front. We think we know, but we're often influenced by our culture or our recent history. So two passages help us come to a conclusion. I'll give them to you in two ways. I'm going to tell you 1 Peter 5, verses 1 to 4, and we'll look at it very specifically on a slide in just a second. Then Acts chapter 20, verses 17 and 28. Now, the reason I mention that is that on this next slide, so let me go here and I'll come back. This is a list of all the places where either pastor or elder or overseer appear, right? What's interesting in the passages that I've chosen in 1 Peter 5, which is on the slide, and Acts chapter 20, verses 17 and 28. One thing, what's the odd thing that you notice on this slide about all three of those words?
They're not in, there's one passage where all three of us.
Yeah, there's two passages where all three. So Acts chapter 20, verses 17 and 28, all three words appear. And in 1 Peter 5, there. In 1 Peter 5, no, here it is.
Yeah.
1 Peter.
Both of them? Or you list Acts twice?
Acts 20.
Acts 27 to 20.
I do have Acts twice, don't I?
So it is just Acts.
All right. Well, Acts chapter 5, or Acts chapter 20, and 1 Peter 5, all three words appear. Now, what that tells us, if we can go back, is that you see that here's the verses for just shepherd alone. And there's only one verse, Ephesians 4. And here's the verse where bishop alone appears, and that's Philippians and 1 Timothy. Here's the verse where elder appears, and it's a ton. And it's elder by himself. But verses where elder and bishop appear, it's Titus chapter 1. Verses where pastor and bishop appear, it's 1 Peter 2. Pastor and shepherd, pastor and elder together is 1 Peter 5. And then Acts chapter 20, verse 17 and 28, and 1 Peter 5, all three appear all at the same time. Now, there's one conclusion you should come to when you see that. What would it be? So here's your pop quiz for the day. If I use all three words, and they're in the same passage, where's the author likely trying to tell us?
They're interchangeable.
They're interchangeable. They're synonymous. They mean the same thing. They have different descriptions, different verbal ideas about what the role does, but they're all interchangeable. So a pastor is an elder, is an overseer. Right? So let's take a look at 1 Peter chapter 5. Is that new to anybody? Okay, a few.
What's new is calling the pastor a shepherd. That's new.
Okay, and that really is what the idea means of a pastor, someone who shepherds. Yeah. 1 Peter 5, verses 1 to 5. Therefore, I urge, 1 Peter 5, verse 1, therefore I urge elders among you, as your fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and one who is a fellow partaker of the glory that is to be revealed, shepherd the flock among you. So already you see two of the words we're talking about. The elder or elders appears in verse 1, and shepherd the flock, which is a command to do an action. Shepherd the flock among you, exercising what? Oversight. Here you have the third word. Not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, and not with greed, but eagerness. Nor as yet domineering over those assigned to your care, but by proving to be examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, will receive the unfading crown of glory. You younger men likewise, be subject to your elders, and all of you, clothe yourself with humility toward one another, because God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So in 1 Peter 5, we see Paul's charge to fellow elders who are spread throughout the Roman Empire. You see that from chapter 1, verse 1, to those who reside as strangers, scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. The specific charge that he gives them is to shepherd and to oversee the flock. So it's almost like elder is the title. It kind of describes the person as well. We see that from 1 Timothy chapter 3. But it's almost as if elder is the title, and the things that an elder does is to both shepherd and to oversee, right? One doesn't very well eld. That doesn't translate well in English. I'm an elder who elds the shop. That doesn't make sense. An elder who shepherds and oversees kind of does. Gina?
Oh, no, I didn't.
Oh, I'm Anthony, sorry.
Oh,
I knew it was this direction.
where do you,
Chrysostom.
I don't know if you're gonna touch on this at all, but where do you, just from being at a conference, I remember hearing that there were, there's the denominations or factions then between like Episcopalian and then Presbyterians. And largely this is because of like church polity.
Church polity, which grew up in the
And
4th and 5th century, yes.
And the roles of like,
Yeah.
what the elders do. And then you even have like churches where like, okay, this is an elder-led church, which is like congregationalist, which is like,
Yeah.
not as elder-led.
Well, and there's even a hybrid. There's elder rule, which you wouldn't describe this church really as elder rule in terms of without going in a whole lot. I hadn't planned on it, but let me say this about that.
Okay.
As Everett Dirksen used to say. Let me say this about that. Yeah, in the beginning, they were all three synonymous, all three of those titles. But by the time you get to the late second century, into the 3rd and 4th centuries, then they had to have some kind of hierarchy because the churches needed to be unified with some measure of teaching and making sure we're saying the same thing. So there started to be developing just a hierarchy to keep the church together. It's not a bad thing necessarily, but what they did was take existing titles and then start to make a hierarchy out of what were once one thing to begin with. They started to twist it and make it a hierarchy in the second place. Again, it's not a horribly bad thing. It's just not originally the way God had explained it. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Does that do violence to anybody's conscience the way I said that?
I think that over time, each of those titles would be refined to be a little bit different than the others.
Over time.
Over time.
Yeah, but the way the original authors had intended it, they were all the same thing. So yeah, so in 1 Peter's just trying to address this of what should elders do, and 1 Peter identifies, hey, I'm an elder with you guys, and we should shepherd and we should oversee, and we should do that well, and we should take it seriously what we do well, right? So let's turn over to Acts chapter 20, or Luke part 2. Luke, the sequel. Again, we've been through Acts chapter 20 several times as we looked at Corinthians. Right after Paul leaves Corinthians, he's on his way to Jerusalem, and he wants to see the Ephesian people one more time. He spent 3 years here. In Acts chapter 19, you have the incident with the two young boys who are being yelled at. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians in the theater for 2 hours, a theater that holds 25,000 people. Kelly and I went to the Hawks game the other day, and one of the things that I have an Apple Watch that has a noise detection on it when the noise becomes a little too loud. Sure enough, national anthem. my wrist starts beeping and buzzing and saying it's loud in your place. That Chicago amphitheater, the United Center, had nothing on the acoustics of the Ephesian theater. I mean, 25,000 people all tilted, all directing their attention at you. And so if I had an Apple Watch during Acts chapter 19, it would have been going off left and right. So Acts chapter 20 then, Paul's going from Corinth over to Jerusalem and stops by Miletus and says, I'd like to talk with the Ephesian elders. And again, with tears, he's addressing them, but in really just 2 verses. Verse 17, from Miletus, he sent word to the Ephesus and called to himself the elders of the church. And then down to verse 28, again, a long discourse and a helpful discourse about what Paul's desire was, his intention was, his love was. Verse 28 says, be on guard for yourselves and for all the flock, among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church which he had purchased with his own blood. So again, not only Paul's charge, but Peter's charge to the elders, shepherd the flock, oversee the flock. And you're to take it seriously so much that Paul is with tears addressing the Ephesian elders that they should do this. So he has 2 different authors, really the exact same content. Pastors are, let's see. And I've read my passages already, so we can go there. Pastors and teachers, then are the individuals who work at discipleship, who work at shepherding, caring, feeding the flock. The overseeing ministry can be either public or private. It could be over a cup of coffee or over a desk. Doesn't really matter. It's that the people administer and they get the body ready itself to minister. Now that's a loaded statement that I'm going to prove next as we get through the next time. So we're going back to Ephesians chapter 4. And he gave some as apostles, as prophets, some as evangelists, some as pastors and teachers. Now for what? So verse 12 says, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ. That's a great statement. It coheres, or it aligns with what both Peter and Paul have been saying. And getting ahead of myself here. All right. Oh, well, I'm good. So, drop back to 15 yards and punt. That's the Chicago Bears offensive strategy. All right. We've seen this up. Didn't plan this out very well, did I?
Well, we're clueless, don't worry about it.
Okay.
We're just-
All right. Now, you're not going to understand what I just wrote. But can you see that in the back? All right. So the way that verse 12 reads, we have the word for, which appears 3 times. The word for appears 3 times. So we read, for instance, in verse 12, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ. But believe it or not, there are actually just 2 Greek words behind that. The first 4 is the Greek word pros. The second 2 4s are the Greek word eis. Right? So I'm not trying to confuse you, but what Paul does is lay out and say, here's the purpose for which the foundational gifts exercise their gifts. And he says just one foundational point when he says, verse 12, for the equipping of the saints. Some people have interpreted it as remember anybody have a King James Version? Anybody would admit they have a King James Version? What does verse 12 say?
This isn't my King James.
Okay. I mean, we all have King
You
James.
didn't ask if she had it here.
Yeah. Do anybody have a King James here?
Okay.
I can pull it up here. What page about? Yeah, Ephesians 4:12.
Yeah.
One sec here. Okay, let's see. So for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ.
Yeah. So the King James takes this strategy of for the perfecting of the saints, for the, what's the second one? The work of the ministry?
For the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ.
Right. What the King James does is assume that these are all three things equal. There's no hierarchy to them. King James takes a position of these three things are all what the foundational gifts are supposed to do. They're supposed to do the ministry. They're supposed to build up the body of Christ. They're supposed to perfect the saints. They're supposed to do the work of the ministry, and they're supposed to build up the body of Christ. Right? That's what the King James is trying to say. Not a horrible translation, but not a great one either. Because what the words actually mean is that the first piece, the pros, is actually the one that says, here's the mission of the foundational gifts. What is it? To equip the saints for the work. To equip the saints is the reason that the foundational gifts are established. To equip the saints is the reason the foundational gifts are given to that church and to any church. They're to equip the saints to do the work of the ministry. Not, it's all the professionals are the ones who are supposed to be doing the work. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. And that's why this verse is a little bit more important to go through. Again, so we're doing a lesson in prepositions. And we're trying to get three different prepositions, for, and for. Again, if you read this casually in English, even in the New American Standard or ESV, it all reads the same. You believe that you'd be led to believe that all 3 points describe how the gifted leaders are supposed to operate. And of course, the dilemma comes about when you realize that these are two different words and they're used in a hierarchical fashion. This is actually the only time this idea of pros, ice, and ice appears. Paul and everybody else has lists of things all the time, but this is the only time in the New Testament that this list is used. And it's the only time it's used a couple different times in what's called the Septuagint. Everybody familiar with the Septuagint? Like the Greek translation of the Old Testament. When they get to the Greek translation of the Old Testament, every time that pros, ice, and ice appears, it's a primary condition or a primary purpose with two subpoints. And that's what Paul's trying to say. So our Old Testament, our Septuagint helps us understand really how the Greek language operated around that time. The pros, ice, and ice means here's the main purpose and here are the two subpoints that support that purpose. So what is he really saying? And I've lost all control. Oh, here we go. So pros, ice, and ice are all equal. Perfecting the saints for the work of service, for the building up of the body of Christ. View 2 is that Christ gifted leaders to the church. They're supposed to do the equipping of the saints, who would then in turn do the work of service for the building up of the body of Christ. Meaning that you and I have been gifted apostles and prophets and evangelists and pastor teachers to do the equipping of the saints so that the saints can go off then and do the work of service. And they can do the building up of the body of Christ. It all places us really in an equal status of we're all meant to work together for the mission that God has put us here in this church. Do you see the substantive difference that makes?
Yes.
It makes us not important, it makes us equal. It makes us, we put our toga on one arm at a time, so to speak. All right, so Christ's giving of ministers, this is Andrew Lincoln says, Christ's giving of ministers of the word to build up the whole body into his fullness is interwoven with the goal of pervading the cosmos with his presence and his rule. Let's say that again, because it becomes kind of foundational. When God gives the gifts, he means for the gifts to have some purpose. And we know that purpose is for the equipping of the saints, right? But also in giving some purpose, it fulfills a grander purpose and a larger design that God gave at the beginning of creation. So he says, Christ's giving of ministers of the word to build up the whole body into his fullness is interwoven with the goal of his pervading the cosmos with his presence and his rule. That is, when God gives gifts to the church, it's actually part of his commission to go and multiply and fill and rule and subdue the earth. Does those four pieces sound really familiar to anybody? Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, which is the message that God gave to Adam. This is what I want you to do. Let us make mankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let him rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the livestock, or over all the earth, and over every crawling thing that crawls on the earth. What's funny is when you read that, again, I can't read the original, but when you read commentaries, you almost get the idea of, and over all the earth, and over every crawling thing that crawls over the earth crawlingly. Just as an emphasis on the crawling aspect. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Did Adam do that? No. Adam sinned. And he fell short of that goal of doing all those things. Now, he set it on his way. He responded, and they had children, happened to murder each other. A little subtle intrafratricide problem. But Adam didn't do really well at it. But the command, nevertheless, was still given to Adam, and Adam gave it to his children, and his children gave it to their children. And it's one of those pervasive things that we understand that in order to propagate the race and to propagate, humankind, we need to fill the earth and multiply the earth and fill it. But also one of the things that Adam was given, and this was part of the role for which he needed a helper, he was to rule and subdue the earth. He was to categorize it. He was to analyze it. He was to take care of it. He was to shepherd, and he was to oversee the earth. In a very real sense, the beginning categories, or the beginning challenge given to Adam was to oversee and to oversee and to, I just said it. Yes, to shepherd and to oversee the church, to rule and oversee the church. I'm sorry, Adam's was to rule and oversee the earth. In a lot of respects, then our role as a church, we're not going into Christian nationalism or taking over the country or nations or anything like that, but our role to rule and subdue the creation that's here in this church is a fulfillment of this passage. Now, I'm not making that really clear. Let me go back to my notes, for which I actually was thoughtful and maybe wise even. God's commandment to man was left partially unfulfilled, the commandment to rule over it and subdue it. Not for their glory, but for God's. That didn't happen in man's early time, and so we had the flood, right? Nobody could rule over the earth, and so God said, enough with that, we'll have a flood. I'm tired of it. God repented. And so then Noah came along, and it didn't have to happen after the flood either. And so Babel, right? People got all up in God's grill and built a tower and said, we're going to be like God. And God rolls his eyes because he made a promise. No, I'm just kidding. Wasn't there. I didn't see God roll his eyes. God doesn't have eyes. That's a whole other day. But it certainly, he gives them Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and says, now I'm going to come through this group. And so the nation of Israel. And finally, it doesn't happen on Israel's time either. And so Jesus and the church. And now we find, as God working through it, it really won't even be Jesus and the church, it'll be Jesus. When he comes back, he's the one who rules and reigns and establishes his rule over the earth. So now the mission is clarified, not with respect to the gospel, which is commanded elsewhere, but with respect to this precious entity called the church, for whom Christ died. We are meant to rule and subdue both each other and our church. But we're to be unified in doing that. And so that's the challenge we have of how do we control, how do we govern, how do we oversee the church in our local, and yet how do we be unified? And we do that through love. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there's no such thing as not having a hierarchy. You have to, if you put two people in a room, you will have a hierarchy in about 5 minutes.
I used to joke, I worked in software architecture for a long time. if you get 10 architects into a room, you'll have 15 opinions.
So is part of God's plan.
It is, yeah.
And so we women, yeah.
So again, this
My
is,
sisters in crime.
so again, this isn't an appeal towards, let's take over the nation, let's rule this as a Christian. That's nonsense. That's not what God intends for us. God intends for us.
Hierarchy is just order.
Yeah,
That's all.
yeah, and that's what God says. Is He's not a God of order, disorder. He's not a God of chaos. In 1 Corinthians 14. All right, so yeah,
I'm just, you were saying along the same lines as Adam was told to subdue the earth and rule over it. You think about the church, you go back up all the way to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. In that way, you can subdue and rule over.
yeah. Even with the be fruitful and multiply, make disciples.
Yeah, be fruitful
Yeah.
for this
Yeah.
earth. Be
Yeah,
multiply.
make disciples, govern yourselves, oversee it. Yeah, exactly. And so you see the church fulfilling that cultural mandate back in Genesis. And so it gives gravity, it gives emphasis and weight, not to the hierarchy necessarily, but to our joint role to shepherd this local church, which is God's gift to the local area as well. All right, so let's move on before I step on my other toe.
Yeah, you already know enough.
Yeah, I got one, yeah. So for the equipping of saints, for the work of the ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ. One thing is that the idea of the equipping comes into play. First of all, this is the only time that this word is actually used in the entire New Testament, this word of equipping. And it's a medical term that means either something like the setting of a bone or as preparation for some kind of medical procedure. And isn't that the truth, that in our church, we come together with broken people, right? People who need to be wisely guided, people who need to be taught the foundations of the faith, people who need to be helped with their issues that they're going through. And we come together all as broken people. And if we don't see each other as those same broken people, if we don't see our brokenness together, then we start getting this natural hierarchy of, I thank God I'm not like that person. And that's when trouble sets in. And we see this in our churches from the beginning until now. The church, again, being full of broken people. And while it's true that our identity is as believers of the household of God, the building of God, the temple of God, nevertheless, they suffer from the impact of sin. Even though we're indwelt by the Spirit, what do? We sin. And to make it personal, we're not perfect, and no one's ever going to be until this side of glory. And so in God's plan, he sends the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastor teachers to mend the brokenness so that we in turn can help others. We're equipped to help others and equipped to encourage and strengthen one another, to bear one another's burdens. And this is part of God's ruling and subduing. It's part of God's plan. And then there are two subparts. In terms of when the evangelists and pastor teachers and prophets and apostles come, they're helping us equip for the work of the ministry. And then they're helping us get equipped. And then two, the church turns around and they're working for the work of the ministry and for the building up of the body of Christ. Remember in Ephesians 2:8-9, for by grace, what? Through faith, and that not of yourselves, it's a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast, right? I'm going to challenge you never to quote Ephesians 2:8-9 again. Quote Ephesians 2:8-10 always. Because it leaves off the purpose statement. For we are his workmanship. Created in Christ Jesus, what? For good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. If we leave off at Ephesians 2:8-9, those are a wonderful statement, and I'm not deprecating the statement itself, but it leaves off the purpose statement for which we are created. And if we get the idea we were just created to sit and admire God all day long in our lounge chair, you're going to get the wrong idea about what Christians are. Christians are to be about the ministry and to be about evangelizing and shepherding and teaching. The work of the ministry, the one another's which the body should be known, are part of the good works for which we're ordained, for which we're selected, for which we're chosen. And we are equipped by the foundational gifts for the work of ministry. And then Ephesians 4:12 in the last part, for the building up of the body of Christ. And we see again a direct reflection back to Ephesians 2, verses 21 to 22, in whom the whole body, being fitted together, is growing into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you're also being built together into a dwelling of God in the Spirit. Almost like a proverb, the whole building growing into a holy temple in the Lord is amplified by the idea of being built together into a dwelling of God in the Spirit. We minister together in unity. True? That's by God's design. We minister in unity, we're built in unity. And following on with the metaphor of a building, imagine if the door decided to identify as a floor. Who's gonna do the floor work? Or imagine if an I-beam decides, that holds up this. I've got an I-beam that runs, along the east and west part of my kitchen, and it holds up the north part of my kitchen and the south part of my kitchen, because it's a longer span of my kitchen. And if I don't have the I-beam there, you have this settling that happens, and I have a floor which everything then rolls towards the middle. I may have that anyway, but that's a whole different question. All right, if the I-beam doesn't do what it's supposed to do, then the purpose of the kitchen is lost. Imagine if a window decides to identify as a garage door. Imagine if the I-beam that holds up your room and gives support to the upper structure decides it wants to go off and be a window. Right, all of a sudden the building's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. The building would soon crumble. And so unity is the aspect that holds all the parts working together, so that together we can accomplish the will of God for the glory of God in making disciples and growing them into maturity. Now, we're done for the day, believe it or not. And I didn't get even to verse 13. So we'll pick up at verse 13 next week. But now in this verse 13, we find out the purpose for all that teaching to come about. Now, I've left my notes a few times, and I know I've confused the daylights out of you. Everybody still with me, or I still got some questions out there? John?
Obviously, we don't see the term priest. Those of us of the Roman persuasion.
Or even Anglican, yeah.
Orthodox, what's that?
Even Anglican, yeah.
Yeah, Anglican. So it had to be early on before the break of Orthodox and the Roman Catholic. So was that around 300 with Constantine, or?
I don't know exactly. I'll research that this week and get back to you.
I just thought maybe you knew.
Yeah.
The fact that God has given all of his children different gifts. That's why we need to come together in unity, because where it might fall down in one area, that's brought up by another person. In other words, it takes all of God's children with their various gifts to perform this unity
Yes.
that God has created.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It takes all of God's children to perform the unity. And what's nice is we're given the unity by Jesus himself, right? Ephesians 1 and 2 tell us this. We're given the unity, and what our job is to maintain it. That's what you see in chapters 1 and 2. Now, when I get next week, we'll talk a little bit more about that unity, but the unity is the purpose. That's all what chapter 4 is all about. Yeah.
There's a lot of conversation that goes on about which gifts, between the sensationalists and the continuationists.
Cessationist.
And then there's the concerns about, which gifts are still, being practiced and still being promoted and taught right now versus, the ones that have ended, definitively for serving its purpose, during the early church times.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering, is there a section you're preparing to kind of cover some of that to kind of encourage people to, here's the gifts that are still going on right now, and we need to learn more about these in order to continue to practice those.
Yeah, I'm not intending to go there, partly because in terms of expositional teaching, that's not Paul's purpose here.
Right.
Is to look what's going on. Now, if I were in 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14, that'd be one of the things I would go through for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, but 12, 13, he's more talking about the unity and the foundational gifts and how they lead to unity. So in expositional teaching, you let the text be the sermon. And the sermon should be about the text.
I agree.
So that's what we're gonna stick with. Otherwise, I get,
There's just so.
it's my hobby horse, otherwise, yeah.
Another question I had was, so would you say it's a primary function, or just a high priority for the elder, shepherd, overseer to teach their flock sound doctrine, teaching them the word, that they be able to grow, understand what that word means, and be able to experience, start to have a clue as to, okay, what are my gifts? And then you have the leaders, as they get to know their flock, they can point some of these things out, and I think you have some gifting here, you need to pray about this and
Mhm.
pursue that.
Yeah, that's,
And then other people, other believers will point things out too, clues to them to, in other words, to discover, okay, what are my actual gifts?
Yeah.
And then how can I now refine those?
Yeah. I think it's Ecclesiastes talks a little bit about that. Whatever you find to do, do it. Is kind of if God puts it on your heart to do something, try it. And God's people who in kindness can then help you say, that's terrific, you should hone that gift, you should get better at it. And some other days you have to say, another gift should be on your agenda. And you say that in kindness, but that's our job, is to help one another, not discourage one another. Does that make sense? Okay, all right, so again, thank you for your patience. Again, we'll pick up next week, 13 through 16, we'll finish that sentence. Story of my life. All right, any last questions? Thank you for your good observations. Anything else? Let's pray together, shall we? Father, again, we thank you for Paul's words to us. That in unity, he's trying to make sure that we understand our role, we understand our gifts, we understand our purpose to be unified, to equip one another, to encourage one another, to strengthen one another, to build up one another in this most holy faith. Father, make it so with us, that our church would be unified, all to your glory, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.